I didn't notice the change at first. Nothing dramatic happened. No single moment where everything shifted. No conversation that split my life into before and after. If someone asked me when it started, I wouldn't be able to answer. It was quieter than that. The kind of change that moves through your days slowly, the way evening light moves across a room. You don't see it happening while it's happening. Only later do you look up and realize the shadows are somewhere else. For a long time, my life looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Stable job, small house on a quiet street, a routine that made sense from the outside. I woke up early, drank coffee that tasted the same every morning, drove the same roads to work, passed the same gas station where the same man stood behind the counter most nights. Nothing about it seemed wrong. And yet somewhere in the middle of those ordinary days, something inside me started pressing a little harder than before. Not panic, not sadness, just pressure. The kind that sits behind your ribs and reminds you it's there whenever things get quiet. Most of the time I ignored it. Life doesn't give you much space to sit with feelings that don't have names. There are bills to pay, emails to answer, small tasks that fill every corner of the day. And I was good at staying busy. Busy people don't ask too many questions. I work in a place where nothing really changes. It's an office building that looks like every other office building. Gray walls, low ceilings, the soft humming sound of fluorescent lights that never fully disappears. Most of the people there have been working the same jobs for years. Some of them longer than me. We talk about normal things. Weather, traffic, the price of groceries, small complaints about the system we use for reports. Conversations that start and end without leaving any trace behind. For a long time, I liked that about the place. It felt steady, predictable, like the ground beneath you wasn't going anywhere. But lately I've noticed something strange when I sit at my desk in the afternoon. Sometimes I'll look up from the screen and watch the room for a moment. People typing, someone walking past with a stack of folders, a phone ringing somewhere down the hall. And for a few seconds, it feels like I'm not fully inside the moment. Like I'm watching it from a small distance. Not far enough to leave it, just far enough to notice it. A few weeks ago, I stayed late at the office. It wasn't because I had to. The work was already done, but I kept adjusting small details in a report that no one would probably read that carefully anyway. Outside the windows, the sky was turning darker, that soft blue color that shows up just before night really settles in. Most of the building had emptied out. You can hear things differently when a place like that gets quiet. The hum of the air vents, the clicking sound from somewhere inside the walls. Even your own breathing feels louder. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen for a while. Not reading anything, just looking. That pressure in my chest was there again. Not stronger, just more noticeable in the silence. And I remember thinking something strange. Not about the job, not about money, not even about the future. I was thinking about how many days in my life had already passed exactly like that one. Wake up, drive, work, drive back, dinner, a few quiet hours before sleep, then start again. There's nothing wrong with a life like that. Millions of people live it every day. But that evening, sitting in that half-empty office, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. Most of my days were blending together so smoothly that I could barely remember the difference between them. When I finally left the building, the parking lot was almost empty. A cold wind was moving across the pavement, pushing small pieces of paper and leaves into the corners near the fences. I sat in the car for a minute before starting the engine. The radio turned on automatically, playing some song I'd heard 100 times before. I let it play without really listening. Across the street, there was a diner that stayed open late. I'd driven past it for years, but had never actually gone inside. That night, for some reason I couldn't explain, I decided not to drive home right away. I pulled out of the lot, crossed the street, and parked in front of the diner. The place looked exactly like you'd expect. A narrow building with large windows and a neon sign that flickered slightly on one corner. Inside, there were only 3 people. A man sitting alone near the counter with a cup of coffee, a waitress wiping down a table, and someone in the corner booth looking down at a phone. I took a seat near the window. The waitress came over after a moment. She looked tired in the calm, practiced way that people in late-night places often do. "What can I get you?" she asked. "Just coffee," I said. She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. The man at the other end of the room lifted his cup and took a slow drink. The television above the counter showed some late-night news program with the volume turned low. Nothing important was happening, and yet something about the quiet of that place felt different from the quiet at home. Maybe it was the fact that no one expected anything from me there. No roles, no routines, just a man sitting with a cup of coffee in the middle of the evening. When the waitress brought the coffee, she set it down gently in front of me. "You just getting off work?" she asked. "Yeah." She nodded like that explained everything. "Long day." I thought about the question for a moment. "Not really," I said, and it was true. The day hadn't been hard. That was the strange part. It hadn't been anything at all. I sat there for a while after that, watching the street outside. Cars passed every few minutes, headlights sliding across the glass and disappearing again. The man at the counter eventually paid and left. The person in the corner booth stood up, grabbed a jacket, and walked out without saying anything. Soon it was just me and the waitress. She leaned against the counter, flipping through something on her phone. At one point, she glanced over and smiled politely, the way people do when they recognize another person is still there, but don't feel the need to start a conversation. And that's when the thought appeared. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet realization that moved through my mind like a small shift in the air. I couldn't remember the last time I had sat somewhere with absolutely no reason to be there. No purpose, no plan, just time passing. Eventually, I finished the coffee and stood up to leave. Outside, the night air felt colder than before. I got back in the car and drove toward home through streets that were almost empty now. Street lights slid across the windshield one after another. Yellow light, darkness, yellow light again. And while I drove, that quiet pressure in my chest returned. But this time it felt slightly different. Not heavier, just clearer. For the first time, I had the strange sense that something in my life was asking a question I hadn't been listening to. I didn't know what the question was yet, but I had a feeling it had been waiting there for a long time. And for some reason, that night in the diner was the first moment I had been quiet enough to hear it. After that night at the diner, nothing in my life visibly changed. I still woke up at the same time every morning, still poured the same coffee into the same chipped mug, still drove the same road to work, passing the same gas station with the same man behind the counter. From the outside, everything continued exactly as it always had. But something small inside my awareness had shifted. It's difficult to explain. It wasn't a sudden desire to change my life. I didn't wake up with dramatic thoughts about quitting my job or moving somewhere else. There was no wave of motivation or panic. Instead, it felt more like I had started noticing things that had always been there. Small things, quiet things, things that normally disappear inside routine. One morning, a few days after the diner, I arrived at work a little earlier than usual. The office building looks different before most people arrive. The lights in the hallways are dimmer. The rooms feel larger when they're empty. Even the air seems slower somehow. I walked past the rows of desks and set my bag down. For a moment, I didn't turn on the computer. I just stood there. Through the window, I could see the parking lot slowly filling with cars. People stepping out, adjusting jackets, checking their phones before walking inside. Everyone moving with quiet purpose. And suddenly I had the strange feeling that we were all part of the same quiet machine. Not in a depressing way, just a very organized one. Wake up, drive somewhere, do the things that keep everything moving. Then go home and prepare to do it again. There's comfort in that kind of structure. For years I believed that comfort was the same thing as stability. But lately I wasn't as sure. Around mid-afternoon, my coworker Daniel stopped by my desk. Daniel has the kind of personality that fills silence quickly. He's always talking about something. Sports scores, podcasts he's listening to, plans for the weekend. He leaned against the divider between our desks. "You doing anything Saturday?" he asked. "Not really," I said. He nodded like he expected that answer. "A few of us are grabbing drinks after the game," he said. "You should come." For a moment I thought about it. Not the event itself, just the idea of it. A bar with loud music. Conversations about work or sports. The same circle of stories people tell when they want to feel relaxed but don't actually know what to say. "Maybe," I told him. He smiled. You always say maybe. That's because maybe usually turns into no. He laughed. Fair enough. Then he walked away, already starting another conversation with someone across the room. Later that evening, while driving home, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The roads were full of people leaving work at the same time. Red brake lights stretching ahead like a long, glowing line. Thousands of separate lives, all moving in the same direction. For years, I had been part of that line without thinking about it. But now I wondered what everyone else was feeling in those quiet moments behind the wheel. Were they thinking about dinner? About bills? About conversations they hadn't had yet? Or were some of them, like me, just sitting there with a vague pressure in their chest they couldn't fully explain? When I got home, the house felt the way it always did in the evening. Still, predictable. The faint smell of the wood cleaner I used on the kitchen table a few days earlier was still in the air. I put my keys down and walked to the living room. For a while I sat on the couch without turning on the television. The silence didn't feel uncomfortable, but it felt noticeable. That quiet pressure from before was there again. And this time, instead of distracting myself from it, I decided to sit with it for a moment, just to see what happened. At first, nothing did. My mind wandered through normal thoughts, work tasks, things I needed to buy from the store, the weather forecast for the weekend. But underneath those ordinary thoughts was something else. A question, not a clear one, more like a feeling that a question existed. And slowly, over the next few minutes, it started forming into something closer to words. It wasn't about my job, or money, or even happiness. The question was simpler than that. It was something like, is this how the rest of my life is going to feel? Not bad, not painful, just quiet, predictable, smooth enough that entire months could pass without leaving a strong memory behind. A few days later, I went back to the diner. I didn't plan it. It just happened the same way the first visit had. I left work late, drove past the building, and suddenly felt that same quiet pull. The neon sign flickered in the window again. Inside, the room looked almost identical to the last time. Same counter, same stools, same soft yellow lights reflecting off the metal surfaces. The same waitress was working that night. When she saw me walk in, she gave a small nod of recognition. Coffee again? She asked. Yeah. I sat in the same seat, near the window. Outside, the street was quieter than usual. A light rain had started falling, making the pavement shine under the streetlights. For a while, neither of us said anything. She moved around the diner, wiping tables and stacking menus while I watched the rain slide down the glass. Eventually, she came back over and refilled my cup. You work around here? She asked. Yeah. Office building across the street. She looked out the window. Looks like one of those places where people spend a lot of time. Probably more than they realize. She smiled slightly. That's most places. Then she walked back to the counter. I stayed longer that night. Not because I needed to, just because leaving didn't feel urgent. At some point the rain got heavier, tapping softly against the windows. The diner felt like a small island in the middle of the dark street. And while I sat there, a new thought appeared. A strange one. For years I had assumed that big changes in life come from big decisions. Moving, quitting a job, starting something new. But sitting there in that quiet diner, watching rain fall on an empty street, I started to wonder if something else was happening. Maybe change doesn't always arrive loudly. Maybe sometimes it begins with something much smaller. A moment of stillness. A few nights spent noticing things you used to ignore. A quiet question that refuses to disappear. When I finally left, the rain had almost stopped. The air outside smelled like wet pavement and cold wind. As I got into the car, that familiar pressure in my chest returned again. But now it didn't feel like a warning. It felt more like a signal. Something inside me had started waking up. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to make the silence of my life feel slightly different than before. And for the first time, I had the uneasy feeling that the ordinary rhythm of my days might not stay untouched for much longer. The strange thing about change is that it rarely announces itself. There's no music, no dramatic realization, no moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. Most of the time, it happens quietly, somewhere in the background of ordinary life. Looking back now, I think the question that started forming inside me had been there long before that night in the diner. I just hadn't been still enough to hear it. But once you hear a question like that, even faintly, it doesn't go away. It follows you. Not aggressively, just patiently. The days after my second visit to the diner continued like every other week. Work, traffic, dinner, sleep. But something inside my attention had changed. I noticed things I used to ignore. The way the sunlight moved across my desk around 3 in the afternoon. The quiet pause people take before answering questions they don't fully understand. The subtle tiredness in the faces of strangers waiting in line at the grocery store. It was as if life had slowed down just enough for me to see the details between moments. And sometimes, seeing those details made the quiet pressure inside my chest grow slightly stronger. Not painful, just present. One evening, about a week later, I was sitting in the living room with the television on. I wasn't really watching it. The screen flickered through scenes from some crime show, voices rising and falling in dramatic tones that didn't quite match the calm of the room. Outside, the street was almost empty. A car passed every now and then, its headlights sliding across the walls for a moment before disappearing again. I muted the television. Suddenly the room felt larger. The silence returned, and with it, that familiar sense that something inside me was waiting to be understood. For the first time, I decided not to push it away. I leaned back on the couch and just sat there. No phone, no background noise, just the quiet. At first, my mind did what it always does. It jumped between small concerns, work deadlines, groceries I needed to buy, a message I forgot to respond to. But eventually those thoughts slowed down, and the question that had been following me finally settled into clear words. What am I actually waiting for? The thought surprised me, because I didn't have an answer. For years, my life had been structured around moving forward, working, saving money, maintaining stability. All reasonable goals, all sensible decisions. But sitting there in the quiet living room, I realized something uncomfortable. I had been living as if something important was always about to begin, as if the real part of life was just slightly ahead of me. After the next promotion, after saving a little more money, after things became a little easier. But what if nothing dramatic was waiting ahead? What if this, the ordinary rhythm of my days, wasn't preparation for life? What if it was life itself? The realization didn't hit me like a shock. It moved through me slowly, the way cold air fills a room when a door opens. For a while I just sat there, letting the thought exist. Outside, the wind had started moving through the trees along the street. The branches shifted softly in the darkness. And for some reason, I remembered something my father once said years ago. We were standing in the backyard of the house where I grew up. I must have been around 17. I was talking about plans for the future, college, work, the kind of life I imagined building. My father listened quietly, nodding now and then. When I finished, he said something simple. Just don't rush past the middle of your life while you're waiting for it to start. At the time, I didn't really understand what he meant. 17-year-olds don't think much about the middle of life. Everything still feels like the beginning. But sitting there in my living room years later, I finally understood what he had been trying to tell me. The next day at work, nothing looked different. The same desks, the same low hum of the lights, the same conversations drifting across the room. Daniel stopped by again in the afternoon. You look like you didn't sleep, he said. I slept fine. You sure? You've been quiet lately. I shrugged, just thinking about things. He leaned against the desk. That sounds dangerous. I laughed a little. Probably. After a moment, he nodded toward the window. You ever feel like life is just repeating itself? He asked. The question caught me off guard. Sometimes, I said. He shrugged. Yeah, me too. Then he pushed himself away from the desk and walked back to his side of the office. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Maybe that quiet pressure I had been feeling wasn't unique after all. Maybe it lived quietly inside more people than I realized. That night, I didn't go to the diner. Instead, I took a walk through my neighborhood. The air was cool, and most of the houses had their lights on behind drawn curtains. Through a few windows, I could see small pieces of other lives. Someone cooking dinner, a family sitting around a table, a television glowing in the corner of a living room. Ordinary scenes, the kind people rarely think about while they're inside them. I walked slowly, listening to the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet walk, something inside me relaxed. Not because I had solved anything. The question about my life was still there. But for the first time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt more like awareness. Like a small light turning on in a room that had always been dim. When I got back home, I didn't turn on the television. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and looked out the window into the dark yard. For years, I had believed that meaning in life had to come from something large. A big achievement, a dramatic change, a moment that proves you've arrived somewhere important. But maybe meaning wasn't something that waited at the end of a long road. Maybe it existed quietly inside the ordinary days themselves. In the coffee you drink every morning. In conversations that last only a minute. In the simple act of sitting somewhere with no reason to be there. Like a diner on a quiet street at night. I don't know exactly what will change in my life from here. Maybe nothing dramatic. Maybe the same routine will continue for years. But something inside me has shifted. I'm not rushing past the days anymore. I'm paying attention to them. And strangely, that small shift has made the quiet pressure in my chest feel different. Not heavier, not lighter, just honest. Like a reminder that life isn't something waiting in the distance. It's happening right now, inside the ordinary moments I used to overlook. And for the first time in a long while, that realization feels enough.